Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. My name is Jeff Loiter. I'm a principal researcher at NRRI. We're so glad you joined us today for this new course on benefit cost analysis for distributed energy resources. We're very grateful to Julie Michaels and E for the Future for supporting this course. E for the Future coordinates the National Energy Screening Project. That's a stakeholder organization open to everyone who's interested in working to improve benefit cost analysis. And their main work product is the National Standard Practice Manual for benefit cost analysis of distributed energy resources, which is really the foundation for this course and will be explained over the next few days. That practice manual is something I became aware of a number of years ago when I first started working in energy efficiency, and spent a lot of time, as many people did, debating how to interpret and apply the classic cost effectiveness tests that were used by public utility commissions, primarily looking at efficiency programs. And those tests were developed in California back in 1983 and last updated in 2001. And so they were getting a little long in the tooth. When I read the early drafts of the new practice manual, it really made a lot of sense to me. And I think what's most relevant for the audience today is that the core idea is that this process, this framework, is designed to value and prioritize the policy priorities in your jurisdiction. We've got over 30 states represented here today in terms of commissioners and commission staff, and we know that your policy priorities are different from state to state, and this framework really helps acknowledge that and value that. So without too much more work, let me quickly do some administrative discussion. We know many of you are interested in continuing education credits for your time here today. You can receive a course completion certificate once the course is done. Please try to join the course through the learning management system. For those not familiar with it, we will spend an extra couple of minutes after the class is done today for anyone who wants to stick around, and we can walk you through how to do that. Importantly, this is a live course. We're all here together at the same time so that you can ask questions of Carl and Tim. And so please do not hesitate to ask those questions. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Sometimes they may get pushed to another day, but really Carl and Tim will do their best to address all the questions. We also have a couple of polls along the way to get your input and feedback, and so that Carl and Tim can sort of get a sense of where you all are coming from and what's important to you. Please don't hesitate to give us your feedback through the RTI website and the RTI support address. So with that, I will not read through Tim and Carl's bios. They were on the screen before, and they will be available on the learning management system as well. Tim and Carl both have been public utility commissioners. They've both published widely. They've both been leaders in a variety of organizations at the forefront of energy and utility issues. Tim quite literally wrote the book, the National Standard Practice Manual. He's one of the authors of that. We know this is going to be a really enjoyable and informative session. Carl, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours. You are muted. We can see you, but you're muted.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share a screen. Thank you, Jeff. And
you're welcome.
Welcome. I recognized a few faces in the participant list. Hi to old friends, and hi to many more people that I haven't met before, but hopefully you'll find this useful. And if you're a geek like me, fun. So I'm going to share my screen. We'll get us up here and we'll get rolling. All right.
Looks good, Carl. Thank you.
Excellent. Good. All right. And I can track some things here too. Tim is going to monitor the Q&A area, and will be able to alert me if I need to stop in the midst of the presentation to clarify anything. Generally going to roll through this. There are some scheduled spots where we're going to check If you have any questions, so you don't have to save them all up to the very end, we try to put them at logical breaking points, but that was from our perspective, and it's your perspective that counts. So without further ado, let's get started with day one of our training. Remember, this is a three-part training exercise. Today's focus is going to be what and why as a benefit cost analysis, and some key categories and inputs that go into BCAs, as well as getting started on foundational principles and how to use a BCA framework for the BCA framework for moving forward into establishing your own approach to BCAs. Day two, which Tim and I will split, we'll talk about developing that primary cost effectiveness test that can be jurisdiction specific, address how BCAs work on different kinds of DERs, including multiple DERs, and then some options for presenting the results, depending on what kind of story you want to tell and what information is relevant to the decision maker. Tim's going to take over on day three with me in the background, and is going to talk about a big issue that shows up in a lot of places. How does benefit cost assessment or analysis differ from rate and bill impact analysis? And then making sure, hopefully we have time to start talking about how we're exploring the idea of accounting for energy equity in benefit cost analyses and distributional equity analysis, which can be a useful complement to address those issues with BCA. And then finally, some key steps for quantifying the impact. So we have some busyness ahead of us. Let's get going with our foundation here and start running through the slides. First of all, it's important to know that a lot of this information is in the NSPM, when Tim was the lead author on it. It was so much fun working with somebody who knew so much about this. We also had a big cast of dozens of other people that provided feedback, and several authors who all helped put together this project. It's also been updated with some methods, tools, and resources, and more information is available at the link that's mentioned there, or you can find it just by Googling NSPM. As Jeff introduced, this manual builds on work that goes way back to 1983, with subsequent updates coming out of California. It's important to note that the California Standard Practice Manual focuses on energy efficiency. With NSPM, what we tried to do is break out of just the energy efficiency box into all DERs, including those combinations, as I said, that we're going to be talking about later. And like I said, more information at the website. All right, with that as background and where we come from, let's talk about what is benefit cost analysis and why do we conduct these kinds of analyses. So starting at ground zero here, the first thing to understand is that benefit cost analysis is not just done in the electric utility or gas utility or utility space in general. It's recognized as a tool that can help make investment decisions. It help in general business decisions of all kinds. Doctors and medical researchers use it for epidemiological decisions, and even FEMA uses it for disaster prevention decisions and how much to invest where in the face of what's growing business in natural disasters these days. So a lot of places where we want to know if the benefits of something outweigh the costs and whether or not we should go ahead with that idea, modify that idea, or reject that idea. So by the way, benefit cost analysis is sometimes referred to in the opposite order, cost benefit analysis. They're pretty much the same thing. In fact, there's no real reason to draw a distinction between them. What we're trying to do, as I said before, is measure benefits and costs of a project, program, plan. We'll get into specific examples in a minute, of an idea of something where you're going to spend money. The people who are big practitioners will trace the history of BCA back to 1936, which started with Flood Control Act. Government, as you can imagine, is always often asking the question, is it worth doing this? Is it the benefits that people or specifically impacted people going to experience, or businesses going to experience, worth the amount of money and investment we're going to make using oftentimes taxpayer dollars? Today, as we said, it's used in many, as I already said, it's used in many industries and applications, and we're all trying to quantify at least some component of what helps us make our decisions. So
Hey, Carl.
a little longer definition here that's going to start introducing some of the subject matter that we're going to want to get into. First of all, we see benefit cost analysis as being a systematic approach, right? So in contrast to an ad hoc approach, meaning that we should try to follow a process that is regularized, standardized, and that can be replicated so that everyone can have the same or have the same kind of look, even if their perspectives vary at one of these project, program, or other investment decisions. I see Tim has raised his hand. Sorry, I just finally remembered to look over. Tim, did you want to say something?
Just really quickly, we had one question about whether the manual has been officially recognized by any state government agencies.
Oh, that's a great question. I am aware of at least one public service commission that has adopted the principles from the NSPM in its use in a rate-making decision. Sorry, the dog. I don't know that it has been formally adopted. I'd probably lean over to Tim and say, Tim, do you have any idea?
Yeah, I know of a few states that have adopted it as a part of their practices. New Hampshire has, Rhode Island has, and maybe Arkansas. And there's a lot of states that are in the process of reviewing it and deciding whether to adopt it. And on our website, you'll see this a nice map that actually shows you which states are doing just that.
Right. So yeah, and I guess the question, or the sort of the thing we should focus on, is the word adopted, right? So the lawyer in me was thinking formally adopted as the standard. It's obviously been used as a template or a framework. I worked with Julie in the District of Columbia with the commission staff there in a workshop process where it was used, it was referenced, some of its components were, if you will, adopted into a staff report. So there's not in some cases it may be more formal than others. Obviously, we're happy if it guides the work, and the closer it hews to what we worked on, as the formula is better for us. But the idea of jurisdictional adaptation, applies in some measure to what we're trying to do as well. Okay, with that, let's keep going here. What is it? What is BCA? It, again, a systematic approach, not an ad hoc approach, because we want to try to use the framing for different kinds of investments, because so many things are done on a portfolio basis. We are comparing the benefits and costs of alternative options, and so we usually run two cases. One case without the DERs, the proposed investment, the proposed action or program, whatever it is, and then one with. And we look over the life of the DERs to make sure that we capture the full stream of benefits and costs that are associated with it. The net result of comparing those two cases is a benefit cost ratio. And if those benefits are greater than cost, i.e., the benefit cost ratio is greater than 1, we can say that the investment is cost effective. If the benefits are less than the cost, the opposite applies. The project, program, or proposal is not cost effective because the costs outweigh the benefits. And then, as I'm going to get into in more detail, if those benefits occur or those costs occur over multiple years, we use net present value analysis to sum the benefits and sum the costs to allow us to come up with that ratio on a comparable basis. When we use net present value analysis, we have to apply a discount rate, which means that how we think about the price or value of things in the future compared to the present. And we're going to explain and give you examples on that. But if you have a big discount rate, one of the things to know is that things in later years will have lower value on a big discount rate. Things in later years will have a higher value if with a smaller discount rate. And we're going to show you that graphically in a minute. So big picture ideas, compare with and without, gather the stream of costs and benefits, compare them to each other using net present value analysis or assessment analysis to come up with a outcome, a benefit cost ratio. So more key terms, just to be very, very clear, benefit cost analysis and cost effectiveness testing are also used often interchangeably, though not always. For us, we'll always use them as meaning the same thing. The broader category that both benefits and costs fit into is impacts, meaning there can be beneficial impacts, there can be cost impacts. So impacts is the category, we're going to use that term a lot. When we talk about distributed energy resources, we're talking about all manner of things connected at the distribution level of the electric utility system or the gas utility system. So these are distributed because it's where they are located and interconnected and operating. The focus on this training is therefore taking BCA, cost effectiveness analysis for distributed energy resources. And there's a lot more terms that apply. All the cool kids who do BCA know all the acronyms, and there won't be a test, but the more you learn, the more you'll be an expert. And the NSPM has a big glossary if you want to get into it. That was a joke. Okay. So I mentioned before that if we're trying to compare a stream of benefits and a stream of costs for the action or no action alternatives, what we need to do is use discount rates to adjust for the time value of money. We're actually going to have three different kinds of ways of looking at dollars when we do this. The first one is nominal dollars, right? That's just the dollar value in that year, if you will, during that time period. Of course, $1 tomorrow is not the same as $1 today, and you've heard your dad or your grandparents say, "Oh, $1 doesn't buy the same as it used to," and all those kinds of things. So nominal dollars are just the denomination. That's how I remember it. What's the number on the bill? But real dollars take inflation into account and tell you that if there's a 10% rate of inflation then per year, then this year's dollar is next year's 90 cents. Because inflation makes that dollar in the future worth less. So that's the second one. First one, nominal dollars, just what does it say on the dollar? Second, real dollars, so you can compare streams of costs or benefits in the future. And then finally, present value analysis, which allows the person doing the evaluation to add their own time preference and the stream at which the discount rate at which they want to discount a future stream of costs or benefits. In the utility world, we're used to often using the utility WACC, the weighted average cost of capital, as the discount rate that is used for valuing future streams of costs or benefits. And that is different and often higher than the rate of inflation, or at least to the last several years where inflation has been relatively low. So keep those three in mind. Let's start looking at some examples. As we do this, by the way, I should tell you, there's no test on this, but there are formulas that show you how you remove time from the equation by making future dollars and current dollars comparable, while still being true to the idea that there are rates of inflation or that there are rates of present value, time preference that are built into it. These are the formulas. It's not important for you to memorize those. The good news is Excel spreadsheets do this all the time for us today. And all you have to do is learn those formulas. That's what I do. All right, so let's see how this works in the real world. Here we've just got a very simple example of you've got $10 of current benefit and you apply different discount rates to see what that number is in the future. And if you do undiscounted, remember that's that nominal rate, the line is straight. It's $10 every single year. But if you have a 2% discount rate or inflation rate, a 4%, a 6%, or 8%, you see these different curves. So just kind of squint at this with me for a minute. Look at the 12-year mark. Around the 12-year mark, that $10 today is $8 under a 2% discount rate, but goes all the way down to $4 under an 8% discount rate. Remember what I said, numbers in the future are smaller with bigger discount rates, and they're closer to the nominal rate with very small discount rates. And that's important because what you're doing is you're choosing, when you analyze a resource, a program, a project that has several years of operating and possibly several years of costs, you want to try to get to things so you can look at it today, even though those several years exist. All right. Pretty basic idea here, but very essential that everybody understands that higher discount rates lower the value in future years. Likewise, by the way, it works the other way as well. So let's look at nominal, real, and present value dollars just to see those three numbers, those three things in comparison with each other. Here we've put in something where there's millions of dollars of benefits. The nominal numbers is the jagged blue curve at the top. It's the current value in each year, as I said. The real value is adjusting for inflation. See the italics on the bottom of the slide. We used a 2% inflation rate. So right away, you can see that adjusting for inflation, going from 2022 to 2036, just 14 years, really reduces the amount of benefit that you get from those nominal benefits that pay out each year, right? Its future is not worth as much when you have inflation, or your future dollar is not as worth as much as today's dollar if you have inflation. If you have a slightly higher present value discount rate going to 3%, you get the gray line here, which shows that your stream of benefits from this hypothetical program is pretty flat over the course of the years once you evaluate against that present value. And again, the bigger the discount rate, the more those lines get pushed down and the value is reduced. We recommend using real values and then for analytical ease, but then applying any additional present value terms that are appropriate to the organization doing the spending or the evaluating as you go forward. All right, let's complicate this one step further and add in a comparison of costs and benefits to see these effects. Now, in this case, we've got a hypothetical program that has costs for 5 years, but benefits that keep coming, just like in the previous diagrams, every year of the program, right? In this case, what you'll see, and I'll do this really fast, but you can see from the previous example, the orange line there is that real, that inflation adjusted stream of benefits, and the gray line is the present value. Here, apologies, we didn't get the colors exactly matching. Here, the gray is that inflation real number, and the present value number is the orange line, still at those 2% inflation and 3% PV discount rate, present value discount rate. So just as this discounting affects the benefit stream, it also affects the cost stream. If you don't have to pay for it all at once, but you get to pay for the program or the measure in 5 equal installments per year, the present value cost of the investment goes down, right? So they say, hey, it's $100 a year for 5 years instead of $500 right now. That actually saves you a little money if there is inflation. And when we put all these together, we actually now have a benefit cost ratio. Like I said, our benefit cost analysis wants to achieve. We can calculate the cumulative present value of those benefits, the orange line, and it's $204. We can accumulate the present value of the cost, $142, and we come up with net benefits of $62. 204 over 142, 1.44. This is a program we should do if we're looking to do it for other reasons as well. And if it's approved, if you will, by management or by regulators, because it has a positive benefit cost ratio, or at least it's cost effective. We know that. All right, so let's go one step further and look at how important the discount rate is. Here, we've taken the same exact data we used in the previous example, but what we did is we looked at having a 5% present value discount rate. So money in the future depreciates faster for this evaluator from this perspective. All right, so now it's not 2 cents to, it's not 2% to 3%, it's 3% to 5%. And look what happens, same program, same stream of benefits and costs, but these higher percentage rates change the formula. The costs still go down under both both the inflation rate or comparing the 3% rate from the previous present value. They go down more because we're using 5% instead of 3%. This firm now has a 5% time value of money, but the benefits actually start to go negative below, if you will, the nominal value, right? Because of that future lower value of money. The numbers on the left-hand side here tell the tale. If the firm or the decision maker has a 5% discount rate, DER, the cumulative present value goes all the way down to 131 because the benefits are stretched out for that 14-year period. The costs go down a little bit, but they're only for those first 5 years. In this case, the net benefits are negative, and the benefit cost ratio is also negative. So this program is not cost effective. That means that the program has to have higher benefits, or they have to come sooner if this program is going to be retooled to be cost effective. All right, so we've walked through it. We've done this most important analysis. Tim, what are you getting from questions?
Yeah, we've got several good questions here. First one is, what's the relationship between discount rates and inflation rates? Are they applied separately or combined, or how do you work with them together?
Yeah, and that's a really great question. Real values, that is inflation-adjusted values, rely on generally available data or forecasts. You'll get them from government agencies. You'll assume an inflation rate, and they serve as the floor for adjusting the time value of money. But a firm that has to make investment decisions, has to go to market to borrow money or float equity, may have a higher need for a higher discount rate, a higher need for near-term profits or cost reduction, and they will layer their private decision-making, like the weighted average cost of capital, on top of the inflation rate. So in this previous example here, where we've got an inflation rate of 2%, but a 3% present value discount rate, let's say the utility decision maker has said, yes, I believe that if I do nothing, inflation is going to operate at 2%. But because of our financials, we have to use a 3% discount rate. It is 2% plus 1% more. Others?
Yeah. One more, two more, but they're closely related. One is, how do you justify the choice of discount rates? Which one should you use in a benefit cost analysis? I see you smiling because that could be its own session in itself. But anyways, that's your question.
And it is a really important foundational question. It's the reason why we're covering it first, because many DERs have long lifetimes, right? Solar systems can operate for 25 years under warranty and much longer after that. So can many other measures, insulation in a roof, for example, or in an attic. So caring about this it's a great question. So how do you choose it? Well, it's a little bit like other decisions we make about the future, right? We apply our best backward-looking experience and our most reasonable forward-looking forecast. Like I said, government agencies can help us with expected inflation rates. We can see this in long-term cost, risk-free cost of capital, for example, treasury bills. That can set a baseline for getting to the real number. But then we have to project ideas like the inflation in the earnings or the increased costs of the firm, like the utility, and that can push the discount rate for a private firm higher than just inflation in order to have capital that be attractive to investors. At the same time, we have to consider other factors, like if we're trying to solve a long-term problem, let's use the example of climate change. If we use too high of a discount rate, well, the joke among environmentalists is, at a high enough discount rate, the world is not worth saving. And with the point being that some things take a while to really pay off, but some things have really big consequences in the future. In those cases, people argue about a societal discount rate that is lower than a private discount rate in order to give adequate valuation to the future. It is somewhat subjective. It may be dictated by policy and precedent. It definitely builds on a base of statistical analysis from government agencies and from lending institutions and banks. But then after that, there is an exercise of judgment in trying to get a view of what's going forward. As we're going to explain later on, one of the nice things about benefit cost analysis is that you can use multiple discount rates in order to get a sense of how programs perform either under a lower societal discount rate compared to maybe a higher private discount rate. And that can help regulators and utility managers make decisions.
Great. One more, and you segued into it very nicely. The final question is a social discount rate being used by any U.S. regulators?
Yes. Several of those, several of those state level programs that you mentioned, that I mentioned, have actually used different discount rates for different impacts, or have decided to use a societal discount rate as the primary discount rate in the primary test, and then so that it includes more programs and things with benefits in later years, but then to filter the selection of those with a secondary test that might use the private utility weighted average cost of capital. So yes, in many places, either for things that have, like I say, sort of climate, long-term societal impacts, equity impacts, others, you might use the lower societal discount rate. Things that are more private, you use the others, and states are picking and choosing as appropriate for their jurisdictional policy.
So I discovered there's actually a whole lot more questions here, but we don't have time to answer them all. So I'm going to just mention two because they're directly relevant to what you've been talking about.
Go for it.
And they have to do with the study period. How do you figure out, how many years to include in your analysis? Right now, you go out through what, 2020, 2035, 2036? How do you define that period?
Right. If you're, remember with the premise here that when you're using this BCA and we're trying to compare, we're trying to analyze, we're trying to inform whether we should move forward with this program, this product, this whatever we're trying to do. So with that, what we should do is look at the useful life of that investment. And then, if you will, sort of do the comparables for the rest of the system at the same life term. So a lot of people, for example, in trying to value the benefit, may do benefit cost assessment on solar, where I've done a lot of work, use that 25-year standard warranty period as the baseline number and say, okay, now if this thing is really going to work for 25 years, or the provider is going to warranty it so that it always does work for 25 years, then we ought to look at what costs and benefits that system has over that period of time and compare it to the do nothing, if you will, or the business as usual option over the same period of time. So it's what you're looking at, what you're trying to decide about, that generally starts your calculation, your assessment of what time period to use, and then look at all the others. Now, don't get me wrong, sometimes things can like go in cycles. Using the solar example, even though the solar modules might last for 25 years, you might have to replace an inverter at least once during that time period because they don't last as long. That replacement of an inverter in, say, year 12 and a half becomes a cost when evaluating that solar option. Same with energy efficiency programs and all our other DER options.
Thanks. So there are other questions, but I think we'll have to move on in the interest of time, and we'll reserve those questions in case we have time later. Thanks.
Great, thanks. All right, so now that we all understand how time affects this and discount rates affect this, I promised you before that there's a whole lot of ways we can use this analysis. And I've been talking about programs and procurement decisions, but here they are in a big table. We don't need to go through them all, but I want you to really think expansively about the places that we can apply some of this analysis. It may and likely not be the only thing that determines the decision, but it gives an analytical foundation, that systemic approach we talked about, to inform the ultimate decision that has to be made. You can't do a BCA on, for example, there's some aspects of what we're doing you can't do a BCA on, let's say, the state energy plan. It would be very difficult, something that big and complex. But you could definitely look at at elements and resources within that plan to see if you're putting together cost-effective resources and exercise some judgment over the overall thing. What I want you to know is that if you're thinking about doing something in the electric or gas utility space, and you want a decision that is not just informed by judgment or by subjective evaluation, BCAs may well offer you some assistance in turning the outcomes into numbers that you can compare. All right, so, and you see it here, goes from new programs all the way to post hoc prudence reviews. And we've seen them used in all of, I think I've seen them in every single one of these contexts. And they always make the decision-making easier and better informed. Okay, so let's do our first poll question. And what we're going to ask is, where's it most relevant for your jurisdiction or work? So now I see the poll has come up. I'm not allowed to vote, but you are. So we'll leave the poll open for a minute or so you can identify where benefit cost analysis might help you in your work life. Let's see what's making everybody crazy. Do you guys take it to the results there in the next screen? There you go. All right, this is good. This spread is pretty even. I mean, it's all over DER programs in general, but then specific aspects of it. Planning is becoming a big issue that we see in various ways. And performance-based rate making coming up, where it can really be helpful in doing PIMs, the performance incentive metrics. So we've got a broad opportunity to. Sorry about that. Dog. We've got a broad opportunity to apply BCA and broad interest in how it can be applied. We'll keep that in mind as we move forward. All right, I'm going to close the poll window and let's get back to work. I'm sorry, we got the very basics. Are there, Tim, as you look at the Q&As, is there anything there we want to address before we move on?
Well, there's quite a few, and they're good questions, but there's so many, I think we need to move on just for time, the sake of time.
Okay. All right.
But we'll get to them eventually, if not today, then at some point.
Thank you.
Maybe at the end of the day, too, we'll have some time.
Okay, good. I'm going to trust your judgment on the ones that need to stop me in my tracks, and we'll keep rolling. So now that we've got the basics in place, a systemic approach takes into account time value of money, compares at least two options to see and the costs and the benefits to see what the results are. The question is impacts. I mentioned that all costs and all benefits together are called impacts, and we divide them by who they impact. This is often called the perspective, right? Who's looking at it? Where do you stand? Or as Yogi Berra might say, where you stand depends on where you sit. What kind of chair are you sitting in? And then we're going to get into the principles, as I promised, about how to put together the benefit cost assessment. So the impact categories come in, I'm going to talk about utility system impacts. I'm going to talk about host customer impacts. I'm going to talk about societal impacts. I'm going to wonder why my dogs are so excited. We're going to talk about other fuel impacts, because what happens in the electric industry can affect what happens in the gas industry, for example, as well. So utility system impacts are basically all those things that a utility cares about and that impact the cost effectiveness from the utility's perspective. They're what happens on the utility system. And if you think about a utility that has a sort of a comprehensive role in electric service, a vertically integrated utility, they care about impacts that are associated. Thank you. My head dog poodle wrangler here, my wife, getting them to quiet down a little bit. They care about everything from generation all the way down through the transmission distribution system, through a pool of other general impacts like program administration impacts, credit and collection risk, reliability, and that increasingly important word, resilience, in the utility system. This breakdown is something we work through in NSPM. There's plenty of room, believe me, from experience, for arguing what things go where. We explain all this in the NSPM, and we try to break it down so that kind of like a chart of accounts, where you can get these impacts and you can come up with a number that fits within each individual impact category and then neatly nests up into the whole. Gas utilities are a little different. Obviously, there's no generator per se, but there are supply issues. They have also things like pipeline capacity issues, which are slightly different than transmission issues, leakage through pipelines, which may have more or less environmental impacts, for example. So we've broken out the gas utility system impacts, where we're talking about a gas utility that might be looking at implementing a gas efficiency program, for example, or a leak control program, where we can analyze these benefits according to, again, a comprehensive set of impacts. Now, we don't always, under traditional approaches, take a look at how things impact host customers. That's the customer who's going to have the DER in their home or business. But they can obviously add to our understanding of the impact of the program. Hosts care about how much do they have to pay, whether they're responsible for any of the interconnection costs, whether this changes their energy life in any way, whether it yields them tax incentives. And there's even bigger list of non-energy impacts that are associated with how host customers approach distributed energy resources. Some customers just want to take control of their energy. Some customers just want to improve their productivity, for example, or the comfort in their home or office. Now, these are all these impacts try to get to those other factors that somebody who's got to have this equipment or have this program running at their house thinks about. And this is one of those places where a different time value of money can show up. In the efficiency world, we talk about the efficiency gap, the idea that some customers really demand a short payback before they'll do cost-effective energy efficiency investments. So taking care to understand how host customers value this stream of benefits and costs is important if you want to understand things like adoption rates and ultimate perceptions of fairness, if you will, benefits. Society takes the biggest view of all. It says, let's look at everything going on everywhere. It builds on the other impacts that we assess, but it also can allow us to get into areas of resilience from a societal perspective. Greenhouse gas emissions from a societal perspective, I could say from a societal perspective for all of these. This raises a point we're going to get to later on, that if we account for some of these impacts at the utility level or from the host customer perspective, and we also want to account for them more broadly from all of society's perspective, we'll have to be on the lookout not to double count a cost or a benefit. More on that to come. The final impact category that I wanted to mention for you, again, is these other fuel impacts. Because when it comes to, say, heating your home or heating the water in your home or business, impacts on the electric system investments, DERs, say a heat pump water heater, will have an impact on your gas bill if you're currently connected to a gas service. So in this case, we look at things like oil, propane, wood, gasoline service that a customer might be using instead of, in lieu of, or as an option to electric service. And we ask, how does this affect that, right? So switching to an electric, if there's a utility program to switch you to, like I said, an electric heat pump water heater, there will be a reduction in your use of gas if you're currently getting your hot water from gas, which will have an impact on the environmental emissions, and it could impact markets and prices for that fuel, as well as delivery costs for that gas system as well. So we really want to take a full assessment of the picture of all the impacts from a program, a procurement, or an option that we're looking at. We want to look at utility impacts, the provider of the program under most of our assumptions, the host customer, the societal view, those who don't directly have the program working on them, but still could be impacted, and then other businesses in the energy space. Okay, lots of impacts. Let's ask a quick question here. In this poll question, we ask you to think about three categories: demand flexibility, resilience, and energy equity. What categories do you think these impacts belong in? So where does demand flexibility belong? Is it a host customer, utility, societal, or it depends? Same with resilience and energy equity. Okay, so starting from the top, and we'll roll it down as we need to, or maybe I can too as well. Yeah, good. So on demand flexibility, people when they look at it, you're saying, okay, what category of impact? Demand flexibility impacts customers? Yep, it sure does. It impacts the utility, has lesser impact on society because it's really something we're trying to capture about the system and how services are provided to the customer. But it depends is also a very wise answer, because it depends on how the program is configured, and it depends whether we're trying to look at demand flexibility impacts on specific customers or in a general sense from the utility perspective. The resilience question, that big word, yeah, huge issue for the utility, because the utility is concerned about making sure they can continue to provide reliable, affordable, safe energy services, or whatever it is. Customers care about them too. Society cares about it. It depends is also, again, what's your focus? What question are you trying to answer? So you guys are really understanding this. It's that where you stand depends on where you set perspective. Energy equity. This is obviously society has a big interest in energy equity, and there are customers who are impacted by utility programs that are not hosts, but nonetheless they are impacted. Society cares about the distributional equity of what's going on. So that is the biggest emphasis for those impacts. But you're right, there are probably impacts on the utility as well, especially with deliverability, with investment decisions for things like grid modernization investments, line upgrades, and of course, host customers. If you're in a program that targets you for trying to improve the equity under which you are receiving energy service, big deal, right? And so that number can be big. You guys are getting this. This is good, or you already had it, and I'm just reminding you. Thank you. All right, let's go to the next.
A couple questions, Carl.
Yes, now the questions that Tim was saving.
So we have three that are a theme, and I'll roll them together. One is, how do you factor in non-dollar based benefits? The other one is, for benefits that aren't measured in dollars, do you translate them into dollars in the same way? And then related and very similar, does the BCA overweight quantifiable factors and therefore underweight subjective factors like quality of life?
Right. Okay, good. Well, first of all, our general guidance is quantify everything you can, and account for variability or error bars, if you will, but try to quantify it as everything you can. And when you quantify it, try to turn it into dollar values so that you can do that apple to apple comparison of all the impacts that you have, right? There may be unquantifiable impacts of customer perceptions, for example, which you could probably measure with customer surveys, but maybe not. There are really purely subjective things that are going to be hard to reduce to a number and then to a dollar. Those factors should be discussed in the BCA and articulated for the ultimate decision maker. So if, let's say you're sitting at 0.99 versus 1.01, if you will, on your benefit cost ratio, you can say, yeah, but this also has this positive impact that might lean you toward the program, or but this really has this big uncertainty or this big risk that we couldn't measure but we're concerned about, that leans us away from doing the program. So you want to quantify what you can, monetize everything you can quantify, and at least discuss and qualitatively assess if you can't get to either of those.
Thanks. Another good question. Is it enough that a proposed project is cost effective? Shouldn't it be compared to alternative uses of those resources that might yield even greater cost effectiveness?
Right. These are good. These are insightful questions. What'll help you a lot on that is getting clear about your policy first, understanding what are the policy priorities in your regulatory jurisdiction. Because you're right, reducing it down to one number, a program might come out at 1.1 and another program could come out at 1.15. Is there an automatic choose the 1.15 decision there? No, only under probably the rarest of circumstances will just such a slight difference make a difference. On the other hand, 1.1 versus 5.7, that's, you're talking about getting real program benefits there that greatly outweigh the cost. If you're trying to do that, then you go down that pathway. But there's a circumstance in which a 5.0 benefit ratio might not be chosen for a 1.0 benefit ratio, where that 1.0 benefit ratio is closer to, aligns better with policy objectives. So this informs decision making. It adds a measure of quantitative assessment, but the ultimate call often involves other factors as well.
I'll add a little bit to that. One is, we'll be talking about looking at multiple DER types and how to optimize them. I think it's in day 3, and that kind of gets at this very question.
That's a really good point, because those numbers could be all over the place. And many utilities, I remember when I was running energy efficiency programs, we ran our programs as a portfolio. And that allowed us some flexibility if uptake on programs varied from our expectations in later years of the program.
Well, yeah, and I'll add that one example is with energy efficiency programs, you often have some that are, very cost effective at 2.2 benefit cost ratio, and some that are much lower at like 1.1, and yet for example, the 1.1 might serve an important sector of customers, like low-income customers, or an important market segment. So it's very common practice to include measures and programs that are less cost-effective than others if there's a good policy reason to do so.
Yep, exactly. Nicely summed up. Other questions you want to talk about?
Last one, then we'll move on. Do you ever calculate different BCRs for utility system, host customers, and society as a whole?
Do you ever calculate different what?
Different benefit cost ratios.
Oh, benefit cost ratios for, again?
For utility systems, host customers, and society as a whole.
You definitely could have benefit cost ratios coming out of those. Generally speaking, what we advocate is that you choose a primary test that chooses which of those perspectives and impacts you want to assess. And by the way, it may be all utility, some host, some societal. It's not a in for a penny, in for a pound kind of thing. And use that as your primary test. So then when you look at other programs, procurements, product ideas, you can compare them on a level playing field, if you will. But doing variations, hey, we're just going to look at utility, not the host or societal on the same program, for example, to get what that benefit cost ratio is something that is, I think, fits well into the category of that secondary test. So screen, for example, a lot of jurisdictions on energy efficiency will screen all energy efficiency programs by under the old traditional total resource cost test or the societal test. And they'll say, okay, let's get everything into the table there. But then what we might do is say, let's look narrowly at or more narrowly at the utility benefit cost ratio to see whether or not the utility is negatively impacted, and there might be a need for some kind of incentive to make up the difference. So yeah, answer is yes, but generally speaking, establish that primary test and then use other screens as a secondary test methodology. Okay? All right, so now let's put these ideas. We got our impacts that we want to assess. We understand the time value of money. We know we're going to have to get data on costs and benefits. Let's move forward and start putting this into a framework. And hey, I just keyed this up. I guess I did read the slides ahead of time. We're going to start by going through our fundamental BCA principles. We're going to go through a stepwise process to develop that primary test. And then we're going to explore when and how we might use the secondary cost effectiveness evaluation. So what are our fundamental principles? These are the ones that we wrote into the NSPM. We think they'll guide you towards good and reliable BCAs. And having seen them in action, I believe there's evidence to support that hope, in fact, as an expectation. I want to go through each of these, but let me highlight for you generally what's going on. Remember what I said before, and I'll say again, it's a systematic approach. So these are the places where we saw potential flaws or misleading results, where if you follow these principles, you can help avoid those, and you can reduce at least the level of controversy when everyone is discussing the BCA that you produced or that someone else produced. It's the starting place. What's our frame of mind, if you will, as we get into it? Let's dig into these. Principle number one, and that principle is recognize they provide resources, can provide needs, and so they should be paired with other resources and treated consistently. Why? Well, because it reduces the risk of over or under investing in a resource, right? If you use a consistent framework, you know which one has the 1.1 and which one has the 6.1, and you're comparing them on that level playing field. If you take a siloed approach where every measure, every DER gets a different test, then all you're going to have is arguments. So consistent BCA framework is a great place to start. And we've provided enough flexibility, and you can provide enough flexibility in your primary test to allow its use on several kinds of resources. And that means you can go not just comparing resources, but you can prioritize them, or you can arrange them into the optimal portfolio that aligns with your policy priorities. Consistency makes your job easier in the short run and in the long run. The opportunity and the challenge, of course, is trying to get these BCAs used outside of one regulatory house over into others. If the Energy Office and the Public Service Commission use the same BCA analysis, if the legislature uses the same BCA framework, now we can talk about making some pretty consistent decisions across the jurisdiction. The planning continuum, things, you are being, if you're in the utility business, you are being called to look at or produce plans that are just growing. What used to be the simple thing, just bulk power system planning, has now been added to by integrated resource planning, of course, but then distribution planning and assessment of DERs. Consistent principles can apply vertically as well as horizontally, and that's the point of this graph. And they'll give you the same benefits if you do that as well. All right, we've mentioned it several times, but articulating your policy goals, getting clear on where your policy is an absolutely essential step of you having that consistent framework in place. The way I've seen it done is that people will sit down and they will look at all the relevant statutes and regulations that impact what the utility has to do, and tease from those what the reasons were for those statutes and regulatory programs in order to document them all and make sure that there's an understanding of what the jurisdiction's policy goals are. No surprise, the kinds of things you're going to see in the common goals: safe, reliable, affordable service, equity, just and reasonable rates type things, also specific resource goals, but then there's also other applicable goals that come up, and those are really important because they may be very important in your jurisdiction or with your legislators or your current commission, for example. Things like jobs and local economic development. When we talk about those policy goals, and once we internalize them into our thinking, we can move from the sort of hardened traditional perspectives that originally were developed, thank you, by the California folks, into a regulatory perspective that allows us to account for the cloud of impacts that we want. So we're moving here from left to right? It's an expanding onion, if you will. Utility system impacts are sometimes called, the program administrator impacts. Next, adding in hosts, customers, and other fuel impacts to give us that total resource perspective, and then broadening out to societal, but doing so in very specific steps. And that were somewhat constraining in some jurisdictions, and was the source of some controversy, fighting over which one we were going to go with. The regulatory perspective allows us to say, look, we have statements of policy. We can figure out what that cloud is that builds on the utility system impacts in order that we can do the right thing for our jurisdiction. So that difference in these two diagrams is all about bringing it home, and that's important. Traditional cost effectiveness tests, I'm going to just get these all up here to save time. Oops, there we go. That I just talked about. They're used and mapped in this way: utility cost, total resource cost, it adds in participants, and the societal cost. Those are the most common ones, the ones I just showed you. Sometimes we narrowly focus just on participants when we're trying to really fine-tune our program design, or we look at ratepayer impacts, but that's not really a cost effectiveness test. It's actually just a test of equity between who pays, who benefits, when do they pay, and when do they benefit, of legitimate questions to ask, but not a cost effectiveness test. So getting that regulatory perspective, this is just another chart of the same thing that I just told you. So it's another way of looking at it, but with some added words, and hopefully this will be a resource to you as thinking about that, getting out of the trap of just being stuck with somebody else's categorization of the tests. The one in blue on the top is the jurisdiction-specific test. The perspective is from the regulator to the decision maker. Who has to approve this program, right? Is it the utility executive? Is it the commissioner? Who's approving this program? We're asking, with those policy goals in mind, will this meet the needs and be cost effective? Will costs be reduced, if you will? And we at least look at utility system impacts, but we look at other impacts as dictated by those policy goals. In other places, you use strict categories of tests, but you don't inform them by specific local policy. We think that's unreasonably constraining, or maybe unreasonably constraining for a specific jurisdiction. Don't get me wrong, the pre-existing tests might perfectly match with your policy objectives. In which case, great. But if not, you have the flexibility to develop that jurisdiction-specific test. Okay. Let me note, good, no hand up. That was, I said it 3 different times, so hopefully that that helps understand that beneficial flexibility. Principle 3 is about symmetry. And what it basically says that, you know, what you try to do this in an even-handed way. And we used an example here. There's actually 3 examples, and let me talk you through them, starting from the right to the left, okay? First of all, we got a program with some hypothetical numbers here, okay? It's got incentive costs, it's got administrative costs. Those are the same no matter what anybody's doing. But then there's a question of host customer costs, what they have to put up to participate in the program to get the benefit of the distributed energy resource. Now, if you include those costs, that adds $5,625 to the cost of the program, okay? Or you could choose not to add those in. And so the total cost that you account for is all the utility costs plus the customer costs or not. Now, customers get benefits, and you can choose to include or not include those and see what happens here, right? So if you choose to include costs, you should also include benefits. You add costs of $5,625, you add benefits of $4,000. Your net benefits, your total benefits are $10,000, your net benefits are $1,000. That's positive. This program is cost effective when you look at both the costs and benefits from the host perspective. If you decide not to look at what the host is getting hit with or what it has to pay or gets as a benefit, you can run down just from the utility perspective, and this program is still even more cost effective because the net benefit cost ratio is 1.78. Either way, both of those ways of looking at it are symmetrical. But look what happens if you decide to only include customer costs, but not include customer benefits. Well, suddenly your program looks a lot more expensive than it really is. You've got an asymmetrical approach that also tells you the program is not cost effective. That's the wrong answer. and it will have you not doing a program that otherwise would be cost effective, whether you considered host impacts or not. And so there's this is just meant to be sort of a stylized example of how you can go wrong if you're not careful to be symmetrical in treating your impacts and consideration of your impacts in the program. Okay. Principle number 4 says, try to get all your relevant impacts. This is the sort of thing I said lines up with what I was saying before. And note at the bottom of this, again, I'm going to put a plug in for Tim and the team's latest work on the methods, tools, and resources, 250 more pages of information to provide guidance. But when we try to do this, remember the first place to start is to ask what your policy is. What do we care about here? Right? So use a jurisdiction-specific approach and study analysis. That's the best way to line up with what your policymakers have set out for you. If you don't have that, then these options, these approaches, tier down towards other things you can possibly look to. Like you can extrapolate from what others have done if you don't have local study information there. You can use proxies if you don't have relevant studies. You can use alternative thresholds different from 1.0 uh, basically allowing yourself to dip in a little bit or demand a higher level of performance, dealing with certain impacts that, benefits or costs that are hard to monetize. And then finally, as I said, if you don't have quantifiable values that you can turn into dollars, you can always use other quantitative and qualitative information to consider those impacts that can't be monetized. But still, you try to get it all to estimated and monetized impacts. That's the gold standard in doing BCAs. Number 5, your analysis should be incremental and forward-looking. This one's you got to put this one in your brain a little bit. We're so used to embedded cost or historical cost of service studies. We look at what did you pay in the past. But benefit cost analysis is not about what did you pay in the past. It's about how is this program, product, or resource going to perform in the future. So what we're really comparing to is your avoided or avoidable costs. I could spend $10 each year over the next 10 years, but if I put in place this program, that number could go down to 8. Well, if it costs me less than it saves me, then that's a program worth doing. It's a future projection, meaning that sunk costs and benefits are really not relevant. That's why the RIM test, as it's often called, is not really a test, or at least not a test of cost effectiveness. It is a measure. It can be used for impacts, of course, but it is not a cost effectiveness analysis. Over the long term, and this goes back to the question that someone asked earlier on, over the long term, we want to try to capture the full life cycle cost and benefits of the DERs we're considering. That informs the length of the study period. It is the frame or the boundaries in life cycle assessment terminology for performing our analysis. Principle 6 is avoid that double counting. I hinted earlier on that when we move beyond utility system impacts, for example, to host and societal impacts, there is a risk. I'll give you a simple example with environmental regulation. Utilities are required to comply with environmental laws. And let's say we have a pollutant in which the environmental law says that you're allowed to put out 10 pounds per year of this pollutant. Well, if they're meeting those environmental laws, they're keeping their emissions at 10 pounds or less, not more, right? So the utility cost to perform whatever functions they're performing already includes the cost of ensuring that emissions don't exceed 10 pounds. Now, it's possible that there are additional emissions that are not regulated, or the 10 pounds, I should say, the 10 pounds itself is still being emitted, and that 10 pounds may have impact on a nearby customer or on society or the atmosphere at large. Accounting for the 10 pounds that are allowed by regulation is the stuff of accounting for the societal environmental impacts of that pollution. And we want to be careful that we don't put the cost that's already covered of keeping it to 10 pounds, everything above 10 pounds that the utility already took care of, and add that as a benefit add that as a cost, if you will, when in looking at the cost and benefits of the societal impacts of that 10 pounds of pollution. Okay, hope that was a little bit clear, but we just want to make sure what's accounted for in the utility system costs, and then make sure that we don't duplicate that if we go to host or societal costs. Public health impacts are another example of that. They typically do not show up in utility system costs as a specific amount, but they can be very different when looked at from the perspective of a host customer or from society at large. And again, there's a risk of that double counting. So watch out for it, and there's plenty of room to make sure the numbers are straight. Principle 7 is be comprehensive and transparent in your documentation. All this work is worth nothing if people can't understand it and come to terms around it. So, like in New York, when we did this under the New York RAV, the utilities published their spreadsheets for doing benefit cost assessment, and everybody could see what their assumptions were, what values they used as starting values for various impacts. And it allowed us to jump right to the most important questions of, should this program happen or not? Is the benefit or the net benefit big enough that it justifies the utility spending money on it? So transparency, how do you do it? What were you thinking about? What were your assumptions and processes so this can be shared are going to save you lots of time in the long run. There's no really good reason that an awful lot of this information needs to be done in secrecy. An open process will actually make more defensible decisions and benefit cost analysis. Of course, there are also requirements to get data from other places, and those things need to be documented as well. If you're trusting the Department of Health to tell you about whether or not, say, pollution has impacts on respiratory illness, the utility may not have that information. They need to get it from somewhere. They need to say where they got it from so we can have a discussion about, what it means and how it impacts program decisions. Finally, and boy, Tim is going to get into this more, I think, but we want to conduct that benefit cost assessment separately from rate impact analysis. A real risk, not to doing them both, but to conflating them into one analysis, because it will give you, because each of those approaches give you different results that are just substantially will confuse each and the other. So remember BCA, this is a little bit of a wrap up. We're trying to identify which DERs the utility should invest in or otherwise support. Rate impact analysis says, well, how is this going to come out in the wash in rates? And how is it going to impact other equity concerns? Very different questions. One is an economic decision, and one is an impact and equity decision. We're asking with benefit cost analysis, what are the future costs and benefits? With rate impact analysis, we're asking, how will this shift the distribution of costs and benefits, especially with already sunk costs? Valid concern, but not the same as benefit cost assessment. And you can see the difference come up in the way the results are presented. Cumulative present values, cumulative net benefits, cumulative, right? And benefit cost ratios. While rate impact analysis says, what's this going to come out to be in terms of cents per kilowatt hour or percent or bill impacts or participation rates? So shouldn't be used. Shouldn't pretend that it's a benefit cost analysis, even if it is a valuable analysis. Tim, what do we got from questions? Tim, you're still on mute.
Sorry.
That's okay.
We have loads of great questions here, and we have time too, which is great. First, there's, I think, 3 different questions about equity, and I'm going to suggest we hold those until day 3, when we're going to have several slides and a discussion on equity. So I hope it's okay for people to wait on those. Some other ones, though, this one I think is really important. What's to keep BCA's objective? The range of inputs seem very debatable and thus able to manage to achieve the results they want.
Yeah, so I was in a workshop with EPA a couple of weeks ago that was on modeling in the farming sector. And somebody made this amazing proclamation that I'll share with you now. When we do modeling, we are not modeling reality. We're modeling a scenario about reality. When we're doing benefit cost assessment, because we are essentially modeling, we are projecting a stream of benefits and projecting a stream of costs and trying to find out that if reality ends up squaring with our expectations of those costs and those benefits, what does that tell us about a decision that we have to make today? We're comparing that scenario compared to the do nothing scenario where we don't have those costs or those benefits. And so what we're not going to get objective truth about the future in any projection going forward. But what will enable us to have useful benefit cost analysis is common understanding of what those assumptions for those scenarios are. That's why this comprehensive and transparent documentation is so absolutely essential. I believe that, nothing else happening, the price of methane gas will rise by 2% per year. That could be a critically important factor, an assumption when evaluating something like electrifying that hot water heater, right? Or the price of gasoline will rise by 5% a year. That's really important when I'm looking at the benefits of that electrification of transportation initiative that I want to undertake. You may think my numbers are off, but at least you know what my numbers are, and we can test your scenario. Numbers would be higher, numbers would be lower, to allow us to evaluate how the program performs under the differences that we may have about those future events, those future costs and benefits. So no objective truth, not necessarily going to be the result if you're predicting the future, but common platform, common understanding for evaluating these alternatives, that's worth everything in terms of making program decisions. Does that help?
Yeah, I would elaborate a little bit. I would say
go
that
ahead.
It's not just principle 7, but it's all of these principles that we've been through that helps prevent subjectivity getting injected or even bias into the analysis. So that's why we propose, a principle of symmetry and, avoiding double counting and being transparent. And here's the key one. One cannot just pick and choose any impact that they like to include because it's a pet impact. It needs to be justified based upon the jurisdiction's policy goals. And that needs to be transparently discussed and agreed to. So that's the whole purpose of having these principles, is to make sure that the analysis is objective.
I violently agree. Very good. Thank you.
Yeah. So there's several more. And I got to say, we do have time. So one is, does it make sense to do a portfolio average of the BCA? For example, can you combine something with a benefit cost ratio of 5 with something with a benefit cost ratio of 0.01, and therefore claim that the latter is okay to do because you combine the two into one number, which looks positive, looks cost effective?
Yeah, without getting into the specifics, can you have a portfolio of things that are not cost effective with things that are cost effective and still end up wanting to do them all? Absolutely. And Tim's one of us is going to talk about this when we talk about multiple measures or multiple DERs. I personally had this experience when the government gave us extra money to do weatherization and allowed us to spend more per customer. We were able to approach a customer's house and do things that normally wouldn't pass an individual measure screen, but as a bundle of services delivered to that home, in conjunction with things that had really positive, big benefit cost ratios, turned out to be a doable package that met the requirements for the federal funds. So yes, it is. I think it's one of the most exciting opportunities for addressing some measures that sometimes don't get taken, or some resources that don't get invested in because they can be bundled in delivery to customers, especially customer groups that we want to identify for under energy equity concerns.
Okay, and are rates considered to be a cost in the host customer cost?
Are rates considered to be a cost in the host customer?
I think I'm going to interpret that. I think what they mean is, are the bill savings, the reduction in cost considered? Oh, I'm sorry. No, actually, the question is, are rates considered to be a cost in the host customer cost?
So I think generally speaking, the answer is no. No, the rate impact, the cost of otherwise, well, let me see if I can tease this into an example. Let's say that I've been identified by my utility as a good customer for a LED light replacement program, that I've got 100 incandescent light bulbs here. And I am targeted for this LED replacement program. I will definitely save a lot of money if I replace my incandescent light bulbs with LED, and my bills will go down. I'll see benefits. And chances are that even if I have to make a modest contribution towards those light bulbs, the host participation cost, I will still realize benefits, especially over the 10 years or so that the LED light bulb will survive. But the utility, by helping me put in those light bulbs, also is incurring a cost. They are incurring a cost that has to do with paying me the incentive. That shows up as a utility cost, but that incentive, if the program scored well, and it will, LED lights are pretty easy, right? If it scored well, the utility will actually save on other costs as on a going forward basis, the cost of serving my inefficient incandescent lights. So generally speaking, we don't look at those rate impacts in the benefit cost analysis. We just want to know, is the outlay less than the savings or the benefits, either from the utility perspective or from the host perspective. Analyzing how the rates will change because they're now paying it, now there's fewer kilowatt hours, for example. That's the stuff of the rate impact analysis. Did I get at the question?
The question itself wasn't entirely clear. So let's say this: we're going to talk about rate impacts and the impacts on host customers and the effect of rates later on, I guess, in day 3. So if you didn't answer the question, there'll be a chance to answer it later on.
Okay, good. All right.
A couple more, and we have a little bit of time left for this. Let's see. Should BCA methods differ when programs are fully funded by ratepayers through, a system benefit charge, or those paid for by the utility or a third party? Should you use a different BCA method? Maybe they mean a different test or a different approach.
Yeah.
Depending on who's funding the DER.
And the short answer is almost always going to be, it depends on your jurisdictional policy. And so you imagine a situation where the utility is the sole sponsor of my light bulb program. It doesn't asking me for any money whatsoever. It's like this example that we used here, right? It says that even though under column C, host customers have costs and benefits, but we're choosing to ignore them. We're using only a utility impacts approach, and we're disregarding host customers. We come up with a result. Note that it is different. We do have a different result if we account for those host customers. But it's the jurisdictional policy that determines whether or not you're going to account for those. You don't choose the test and then fill in the numbers. You choose you craft the jurisdictional test and use the numbers that test tells you to consider, because they're important. I think I just talked myself in a circle to say it depends on the policy. I would not imagine that it is useful in terms of consistency across program evaluation to use one test, say a utility test for some programs, and then a utility plus host and societal test for other programs, because then you've lost the benefit of being able to compare those two programs side by side.
Great, thanks. Another question: do you ever perturb or nudge your numbers to see if the results of the analysis change a little or a lot? For example, make a recalculation with a slightly different discount rate?
The discount rate is an interesting one. I'm not sure that's the first place I'd go for nudging. I might, I'm projecting from times when I was, again, when I sort of was in charge of some programs, and I'd like talk to my energy efficiency program manager and say, hey, Fred, can you get the cost of deploying that program down a little bit? Because it'd really be a good program for us to have in our portfolio. And right now it's not passing the cost effectiveness test. And try to figure out that, well, yeah, if we can achieve either a higher penetration or a lower cost per unit save, we could get that program into the portfolio. I'm not a fan of using different discount rates for different programs because, again, you'll compromise that ability to choose from among programs. On the other hand, I already did say that in some cases, you might see a program, for example, as being heavily focused on providing greenhouse gas benefits, great at delivering reduced carbon dioxide emissions or methane emissions or something, in which case you might choose to apply a societal cost benefit test. But even in that situation, I'd say, a societal discount rate. Even in that situation, I'd say, then use the societal discount rate everywhere and use a secondary test if you want to take another look at the same question.
Great. Yeah, I would just elaborate a little bit, saying that I've been in situations where different stakeholders just cannot agree on a discount rate because it does have huge implications. And so what I recommend is you do the analysis using both, and that way you can see how it affects. And if you're lucky and the resource passes under both discount rates, then you're done. If not, then you can have a discussion about how much do we want to give, how much weight do we want to give to one result versus another.
Yep, kind of like error bars. Could be high, could be low, depending on which way you go, which rate you use. The decision maker can weigh that in. I like that.
Okay, and then one more question, then we should move on. How would a shift to performance-based regulation change which cost test or benefit cost analysis test we should use, and who uses the results, or in what context?
Yeah, so it depends on what stage you are and what step of the process you are in implementing PBR, performance-based regulation, right? So like in the early stages, utilities are often asked to submit proposals, and parties may submit proposals for performance incentive mechanisms, in which basically the conversation is, if the utility achieves this result, faster interconnection, lower frequency of outages or interruptions, any of these kinds of outcomes that we want to define, we can ask the utility, say, well, what would it cost you to achieve that? And we can say, okay, now we value that benefit, and we look at that value, that cost, and we can tell whether that's cost effective, and then we add in an incentive if they achieve that goal. So we're going to pay, it costs $10,000 to implement the program. It produces $20,000 in benefits. We're doing good so far, but we propose a performance incentive of another $20,000. Well, now we're spending $30,000 to get $20,000 worth of benefits. So you can see how using benefit cost assessment, can be used to inform the structure and the level of a PIM, a performance incentive mechanism. Further on down the road, the ideal in performance-based regulation is that the utility has a revenue cap of some kind, and they've proposed a suite of programs, but they're generally on their own to execute on their plans. In that case, the utility would have a lot of cost effectiveness evaluation going on to find the least cost way of delivering on their commitment. And in the ultimate idealized PBR world, it's their business. The truth is nobody's gotten there yet, and we got a long ways to go, and we're going to do true ups and reconciliations. And we want to learn from utilities implementation of performance-based regulation under multi-year rate plans. So it would be great if they documented what they're doing and shared that in that review, so that then future performance incentive mechanisms can really target those highly cost-effective initiatives that the utility discovered under its incentive structure. So what did I just do? I described a world in which it's very beneficial at the front. It's definitely beneficial inside the utility for when they're operating under revenue cap structures. It's very beneficial for subsequent modifications of the performance incentive mechanisms and the structure. I think BCA is an absolute essential about any movement toward performance-based regulation. And in that regard, I turn your attention to some great white papers written by the staff of the New York Public Service Commission on the benefit cost assessment handbook part of the New York REV proceeding.
That's great. I should let you finish up your next few slides, and then if we have time, we can answer a few more questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tim. Okay, so let me go catch up here to the end. We've run through all of our 8, and now we have a question. Which of the following is consistent with the foundational BCA principles that we just reviewed and talked more about? So, Jeff, if you'll put up that next poll question, we're going to be answering yes, no, or not sure. For omit this, for some reason my slide is my slide not consistent? Do I have the wrong?
There was a limit to the number of characters I could put in those questions, and so.
Okay. Oh, you reworded them. Thank you.
Little rewording.
Okay. I'm sorry. I was like looking for the key. All right. So what's on my slide? Let's not worry about it. Let's go with the actual poll question. Emit hard to quantify but relevant impacts if you believe they are immaterial. Yes, no, not sure. Primary cost test should align with applicable policy goals. Yes, no, not sure. Everybody better get this right. Account for lost or gained revenues as a utility system impact. I think we just talked about that thanks to somebody's great question. All right, so take a minute, tell me yes, no, not sure. So let's see where you stand. And then we'll move to the closings. Oh, and the fourth one, I'm sorry. Use a consistent primary test for investments in energy resources. Also something we discussed. So give you a couple of more seconds here to cast a vote in each of these 4 questions. And then we'll pretty much wrap for the day, I think, with just a few more ideas. All right. Emit hard to quantify but relevant impacts if believed to be immaterial. Okay, so we've got a pretty serious split here and a pretty big not sure component. We are trying to get all relevant impacts, and we're trying to remove the subjectivity of belief about their materiality by including them even if they're hard to quantify. So the preferred answer here would be a big old no. It shouldn't be done just based on your or my particular belief. If it's a relevant impact, we should address it. And even if I don't believe it, and even if it's hard to quantify. So might not have been the best worded question, but I do want to leave you with that point. Let's try to get that subjectivity out of it. If it is a relevant impact, let's try to address it. And let's try to quantify and monetize it if at all possible. Okay, you guys definitely understood the primary test and its relationship to policy. Absolutely, the primary test should align with policy. It's the best way to establish a foundation for your common test framework. Do you account for lost or gained revenues as a utility system impact? Maybe I didn't explain this well. Or maybe the questioning is a little unclear here. My answer would have been no, that's part of the rate impact analysis, but it's not the cost, it's not a measure of the cost effectiveness of the program. But Tim, am I missing something here?
Nope, you got it right. And we'll be talking a whole lot more about this again on another day, but it's a good thing we are, because this is important and it gets mixed up all the time. And so it's good feedback that some of the people didn't quite get the message the first time through. So we'll make sure it gets through next time. The answer here should be no.
Right, good. Okay, thank you. Use the consistent primary test for investments. Yes, everybody gets that. A common primary test, a common BCA framework test will allow you to compare apples and oranges, if you will, or maybe green apples and red apples at the very least. So thank you for the feedback, and we will definitely double down on understanding those operational and evaluation differences between benefit cost analysis and rate impact analysis that comes from program implementation. Okay, we've had those questions. Now let's go to the second. We've talked about the principles, so now we go to the second step, and we're going to tee this up for more, but we have a multi-step process for how to develop the primary cost effectiveness test. Remember, the idea here is to get to the primary test that is used as the common test that can be used for many different kinds of resources to allow those comparisons. And then don't worry, you can always decide when and how to use a secondary cost effectiveness test and we'll talk a little bit about how you can enhance your understanding of your program options that way. What are the steps? Well, it's really 5 things. I'm introducing them now. We're going to spend more time on them tomorrow. Number 1, no surprise here, articulate the applicable policy goals. Get that straight, and a lot of it is going to be easier. Second, always include all the utility system impacts. This, of course, is under the assumption that we are reviewing programs, procurements, and actions by the utility. Okay, so we always want to include all those utility system impacts when we're looking at those programs. Then we go to that outer cloud that I described in the diagram and ask ourselves, consistent with policy goals and other factors, which non-utility system impacts do we also want to include? Which ones are important to us? The cost and the benefits that individual customers might realize as hosts, for example. And then ensure that we're still addressing those benefits and costs properly, revisiting our principles, of course, things like symmetry, right? And incremental marginal costs and benefits over the long term, the life cycle of the DER measure. And of course, document your work so that people can tell what you did and that we can have a meaningful discussion about how the evaluations were conducted. That third block, when and how to use secondary cost effectiveness tests. Again, you may want to decide on a major test for your primary cost effectiveness. You do want to. You want to select one, you want to get one in place, but there may be other times in which you want to do another test that's different, slightly differently configured, may have a different discount rate, may include host customer impacts, or may exclude host customer impacts. And you may do that in specific situations, sometimes where policy goals maybe can be a little confusing or even at odds with each other, or where you want to take a closer look at DERs that sit right around that 1.0 line, but just barely over, or maybe just a little shy. Or finally, where you want to address implications, say, to society through the use of a societal cost test of achieving policy goals, or to focus more narrowly on how is this going to, what's the benefit cost ratio for the utility alone, even if there are big societal benefits out there. We've already used several times, explained the example that you could use a societal discount rate, the primary test, that'll give you the biggest range of programs passing the test, maybe where the societal discount rate is lower than the utility discount rate and where we've got a long-term stream of benefits. But then you might use the utility discount rate, frequently the weighted average cost of capital, in a secondary test. Okay, so there's flexibility in this that can be matched to your jurisdictional situation, and that allows these tests to inform decision-making in a much better way. So let's wrap up the day here and leave it open for any more questions and discussion that we want to have. Today we've visited the purpose of BCAs and understand that they're not just used in the utility space, but what we're trying to do is trying to figure out whether a program or procurement or something goes forward, whether it is economically cost effective. I understand that since that stream of benefits and costs may happen over a period of time, we need to use a discount rate for inflation to turn nominal numbers into real numbers. And then it's appropriate to add in on top of that, our own valuation of the time value of money, which would be the present value discounting rate. We've looked at the fact that there are a lot of categories out there, and our recommendation is no matter what you do in adopting a test, you start from the utility system impacts, all of them, and then make decisions about other impacts that are going to be added. We've went through all the foundational BCA principles, which help us build confidence in our decision-making, or at least in the analysis that informs our decision-making, and understand that sometimes we may want to have both primary and secondary cost effectiveness tests, especially we want to test some variations, if you will, on program design, on portfolio scope, more of which we're going to talk about tomorrow. So that brings me to the end of my slides for today. Tim's got his hand up, meaning we've got some more questions. Tim, take it away. What do you got? Oh, still on mute.
Yeah, sorry, we have several questions. We probably have room for two, maybe three. There's a theme I've noticed on several questions about hard to quantify impacts, such as extreme weather events, like the costs of extreme weather events. And in the situation like that, where the potential outcome is very expensive, but whether it occurs is very uncertain, what does one do? How do you account for those kind of uncertain effects?
Right. So you're going to talk about this, I think, some more, or I am. I think it's you, right? When we talk about externalities and how we quantify those factors. But essentially, this is what the economists call an externality, right? We've got not only do we have an extreme weather event that is possible, we have a measure or a program that might reduce our exposure to that. We've got a little bit of a butterfly effect problem here because we don't know which pound or ton of greenhouse gases, for example, is actually going to lead to the nor'easter or to the hurricane, coming ashore. So we're stuck having to look at these things from the perspective of values which can be generally available even if we don't have specific data. So we may not know that it's going to be $1 million cost in substation repair every time there's a hurricane, and we sure as heck don't know exactly when hurricanes are coming ashore. But we can use numbers like the total cost of damage divided by the total number of tons of carbon dioxide and add that number in as a cost for environmental emissions that are not otherwise controlled by the program manager. That is called the social cost of carbon and has been calculated through a methodology developed by the federal government. and gives us a number. It's the best guess of the damage cost and or avoidable damage cost per metric ton of greenhouse gas emissions. That's one way to do it. We could ask another question, which is, what would it take in this program to, let's do a hypothetical gas-fired emergency generator program, which will have some emissions associated with it, assuming fossil methane gas. We can ask ourselves, well, what would it cost if that generator were not gas-fired, but in fact were constructed to be solar plus a battery? These are kind of the IRP decision that we do. And that control cost can also be used to try to put some boundaries around those stream of future costs or stream of future avoidable costs. So you think I got at it there, Tim? Is there more?
Yes, although you don't have the benefit of seeing all the questions, and I do. So I think there was at the heart of the question is, what about uncertainties? And actually, we got a follow-up question. Do you ever use probabilities to value uncertain impacts? And if you don't mind, I'll just answer it.
Yes, please.
By saying that, yes, probabilities are perfectly appropriate to use. They do add complexities and challenges, but they're perfectly appropriate because nothing is certain and some things are highly uncertain. I would just add that in the Methods, Tools, and Resources Handbook that Carl mentioned at the outset, there is a short chapter on risk and how to account for risk. And one could write several textbooks, and some people have written several textbooks on how to account for risk. We tried to distill some of the key points down in that, so I encourage you to look to that for more information on how to deal with risk and uncertainty. But the answer is, yeah, there are ways to deal with it. It's not simple, but there are ways.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think one more question, and the others we might be able to address at another time somehow, but this is an important one. Like, any advice for sort of embarking on the conversation to change the primary test used? Like, if they're using a TRC or a societal cost test, how do you encourage people to move to a jurisdiction-specific test? The question is, says, these conversations can be very heated with stakeholders having very strong opinions. So, you know, that's what this manual is all about. It's yes, in fact, that's one of the reasons why we produced the manual, because I personally have sat through hearing after hearing after hearing of contentious debates around whether to use the societal cost test, the utility cost test, or the TRC test. And if you adopt this framework that we're proposing here, it allows for a reasoned, a transparent, and a robust discussion that avoids some of the controversy and allows people to kind of focus on the key issues and the key areas where they might differ. And those key areas are really as simple as, well, I think the policy goal should be this, and you think the policy goal should be that, get agreement or not, and then that kind of dictates your test. So the whole purpose of this manual is to try to encourage that kind of transparent and knowledge-based, informed discussions, so that they don't get heated and controversial, and you know they become useful for every party that is interested in the topic.
Thanks, Tim. And I'm sorry, everybody. I don't know. Looks like Carl maybe had a problem. He has taken leave of us for, or at least for now. I'm sure we'll have him back tomorrow. And I would agree with you on the last one, Tim. As I think I said at the beginning, that was sort of my first exposure to this, which was around those very debates about which test. And I agree. I think this, as a former user of this approach, I think it really does help those conversations. It's 4 o'clock, and so we want to let everybody go content-wise. I am going to ask Catherine Klein, my colleague, to come on and share her screen. For those of you who are not familiar with the learning management system, she's going to just walk through quickly how to use it to find the related materials.